I check it. The biggest Christian you know, the best person you know, still has room to grow. All right, it's Buff Missionary. We out here back in these streets studying through Lamentations. And between Lamentations and the things I'm learning in my class, great day. My mind cannot handle it. But that's why I'm trying to be a doctoral student, so I can level up in my thinking and my processing and the way that I interact with the world. You know what I'm saying? It's fantastic. But what's not fantastic is studying through Lamentations, because this book is kind of depressing. But that being the case, there are a lot of good things and insightful things that I can learn and apply to my own experience that are very valuable. So just because the situation is a little depressing doesn't mean there's nothing of value, doesn't mean there's nothing that you can learn, doesn't mean that there's nothing to appreciate from the situation. And we're going to get into that today. Go ahead, like, subscribe, and share if you've seen some of the other videos. Hopefully you're able to catch up to this point. We are now moving into chapter 3. This segment is entitled The Prophet's Anguish and Hope. Both. I think we've seen a lot of anguish so far in the first couple chapters through the personification and expression of Jerusalem's pain. But here we go more specifically into what Jeremiah is feeling and what he's thinking. And we find that what Jerusalem is feeling, he's feeling too, for the most part. There will be a little switch here in the middle of the book. We'll get to that eventually. I'm going to put in the description down below questions that I like to use when it comes to Bible study to make things more practical for me. These are things just so we can find, what's God trying to say to me in this verse? Let me not just read the story for the sake of being able to recite to you the story, but what can I actually gain? What's God trying to say to me in my context? What are the principles that we can gain from this story, from this narrative, that I can put into practice in my life today in a meaningful way? Super valuable. I'm not going to repeat them all, but there's 4 of them down in the description. Go check them out. All right. Chapter 3, verse 1. And we're going to go just through the first few verses today because of something that stood out to me that I want to touch back on. Verse 1. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. Listen to these words now. And if you're familiar with probably some other passage in the Bible more than Lamentations, some of these things will stand out. He has led me and made me walk in darkness and not in light. Surely he has turned his hand against me time and time again throughout the day. That's the first 3 verses. It's a quick hitter. But even in that, we hear the despair. We hear the anguish, and we see his own personal reflection on what he's seeing and the cry that he's heard from Jerusalem talking about its despair. This what's the song? It's not a deluge. There's a word that kind of sounds like deluge that's supposed to be like a song, like a sad song, something like that. I can't remember, but it's like right on the tip of my tongue. Anyways, I'm the man who has seen the affliction. He's seen everything from chapters 1 and 2. He's seen this. He has led me and made me walk in darkness and not in light. He's going through this. This is, you kind of get the sense that, yeah, he's reflecting on it, but he's also talking about what he's saying God is making him experience. Surely he has turned his hand against me as a prophet of the Lord. God has turned his hand against me time and time again throughout the day. Man, imagine being in a position where you're trying so hard to achieve something and you feel like you're right there and it teases you, but it slips out of your fingertips and you get close again and it slips out again. It's a tough position to be in as the person who's supposed to be the representative, the voice of God to the people, while hearing this cry of what God has done to the people. It's tough. Not an enviable position to be in. And I would argue that in a very practical sense, people who are Christian and who are vocal about, hey, I think Jesus is cool and I think some of these principles are worth checking out for you too. I think people who are in that kind of mission mentality and want to go and serve other people and share something beneficial of the gospel with others may also find themselves in this situation sometimes. There's a lot of different factors there. What's the context of the people that you're trying to reach? Are they in this kind of despair? They could be. We don't know, right? Depending on your approach, for a lot of people, as we've talked about in some of my videos, it's just, hey, here's the message and you need to accept it. Otherwise, you're going to hell, regardless of where you come from, what your background is, what you've been through. And a lot of times Christian people go into these types of contexts and are trying to save someone. And because someone is not in the mindset or the position to accept it, oh, you're going to hell. And they blame it on them. No, no, no. That's the Christian's fault. That's the Christian's fault. 1,000,000,000%. All right. You cannot hold these people accountable to something that they are not physically, mentally, psychologically able to process and grasp at the time. Just because you showed up and said something doesn't mean you did your part. That's the very least you could have done. All right. And that's to the Christians out there. I say that to myself as well as a reminder that, hey, if we're trying to go out here and impact people in a positive way, we got to do more. It's more than just yapping. Talk is cheap. Talk is cheap, baby. That's why a lot of people do it. But how many people put their money where their mouth is? As you've heard them say, talk is cheap. So you got to put your money where your mouth is. Make it worth something. Make it worth something. But the language that Jeremiah is using here, I find so interesting. Almost immediately, just after reading the first few verses, Psalm 23 is actually what came to my mind. Now, at the beginning of chapter 2 of Lamentations, when I was getting ready to do that video, it was Psalm 23 that came up. That was because of chemistry and tests and problems along those lines. But the language of Psalm 23, you hear it here, but almost in the exact opposite, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters, compared to he has led me and made me walk in darkness. You have that contrast. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Oh, it's all good. For you are with me. And yet here, time and time again throughout the day, he's turned his hand against me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me, from Psalm 23. But here, your rod is a rod of wrath that has shown me affliction. Even the word surely, which has so much implication even of itself, not just because of what it's attached to, but surely your goodness and your mercy shall follow me and cover me all the days of my life, from Psalms 23. But surely here, surely he has turned against me and turned away from me. It's a contrast, an interesting contrast. And again, when we look at the two people who are responsible for these words, you have Jeremiah, a prophet of God, on one hand, and then you have David on the other hand, who's known after a man after God's own heart. You could say for both of them that they had a certain understanding of God that might have been better than the people around them. But yet when you look at other Psalms, you see David expressing the same stuff that Jeremiah is expressing here. And if you go back to a verse like Jeremiah 29:11, you hear Jeremiah expressing things like what David did in Psalm 23. So there's both. Now, the question I have is this because the people are confused, or because the picture that we get of God is confusing? Well, I think it depends on how you relate to it. I use the word relate because I believe that spirituality is about relationship. And within relationship, there's room for complaining. There's room for grumbling. There's room for hard discussions if there's a relationship there, because then it becomes something that you grow from. But if you try to have a hard discussion with somebody that you don't care about, someone that you're not in a relationship with, someone that you're not in any kind of relationship with, suddenly things are not going to end that well. Your response is going to be framed by the relationship you have or don't have with that individual. I think back to a time when I was working at Palau Mission Academy, one of my years out in the mission field there. We had a couple students who got in trouble for some things that were going to cost them their role as a student. They were going to be expelled. And in both of these cases, in a number of these cases, I found that the students that had a lot of these types of issues were often the ones I was closest to. And I don't know, it's kind of weird. I felt drawn to them. There were a lot of great students that I had good relationships with, but I almost felt drawn more towards the ones who struggled a little bit more. And I remember this particular student that I was responsible for finding the things that were of issue, and I had to bring it forward. And I ended up talking with the student about this, and they responded to me pretty well given the circumstances. And when I was able to talk with that same student years later, we still have to this day very good relationship, and communicate very well. I'm not gonna say regularly, because we don't, but when we do, it's always a good time. It's always a good time. Even though I had to deliver something that was crushing to this student in that moment, I believe that the relationship that we had was seen as bigger than that moment. And it allowed us to have that kind of an experience, which was tough. It was hard for me to share that with that student. It was hard for that student to hear that from me. But because of the relationship we had, we were able to move past that, because both of us were bigger than that moment. Now, there might have been other members, other missionaries out there who didn't have that kind of relationship with the student. And I know that other missionaries were also put in the position to have to communicate these types of things with students in these types of situations. And I also know that those relationships aren't so great right now, or not so great. I would say non-existent. They don't exist now because they didn't exist in those moments. So the perception that the student had of that moment is a lot different than a moment that they had with me in that particular instance, because on one hand there was a relationship and on one hand there wasn't. Completely different response, even though it's the same messaging and the same thing that's being shared. So when we look at that and we see this anguish that Jeremiah is expressing here, he has a relationship with God that creates the space for the tension. And because there's a relationship there, there's room for more tension. Because of the way that we see David connecting with God, through the book of Psalms, we get to see a whole lot more of the tension that he also experienced with God. There's room for both. And the crazy thing is, even though we see and acknowledge that, yeah, he had a pretty decent relationship with God that allowed for the tension, the next step in that is saying that, wait a second, he still didn't have it all figured out. It isn't just the fact that he had this great relationship with God that allows him to wrestle with reality and the practical application of this relationship. There's also the understanding that in the relationship, just because you're in one doesn't mean you fully know the other person. Take people who are dating or aiming to be married at some point, right? Or better yet, take people who, take them both, all right? You could take the same thing, whatever you want. If people start to date, they enter into a relationship, it does not mean that they're done learning about each other. There's still a hell of a lot more learning to go. And a lot of times when people get into stuff too soon and they assume that they know too much too soon and get married, marriage doesn't last. Why? Because they didn't take enough time to actually get to know each other or acknowledge the fact that there was still more learning to be done. The most successful of marriages, the most longest lasting marriages, I believe, are founded in this principle that there's still something to learn and there's still ways to grow within the relationship. It's not that you're marrying somebody at this point and this person is going to stay this way forever. There's never going to be anything left to learn. Not at all. There's going to be things to learn. There's going to be new things to experience. There are going to be challenges. That's why the vows, the classic vows for that you hear at weddings are like that, in sickness and in health, and all those things, right? Because you're assuming that the situation is going to change from this moment. I think the interesting thing of how this story and this concept relates to mission in particular, and there's a heavier mission aspect here because I'm back in classes, so my mind is in this mode. I think it's because when people enter into that spiritual relationship and they're in their church or their spiritual community, A lot of times, if mission is an emphasis of that community, it's kind of posed in the sense of, we've got this and our relationship is fixed, but the people that we're going to reach is not fixed. And in fact, they might not have one at all. So we need to bring those people into this so they can be here where we are. That kind of rhetoric, whether it's expressed or not, said or unsaid, is completely wrong. Because it's not about me trying to go bring other people to where I am. I'm here. God is there. Everybody else is right here with me. Or let's put it this way. God is up here. We're all here. And we're all trying to get close to God. Whether I happen to know a little bit of this and the other person knows a little bit of that, doesn't matter. We're all here on the ground level trying to get closer to God. Just because I have my master's doesn't put me up here to someone else who's never been to high school. Not at all. We are all down here. And I have just as much more to learn about God than that person has. It's the same. We're equal. Me having a better knowledge or a perception that I might have a better knowledge of who God is doesn't put me above anybody. I'm still on the same level. I'm still on the same playing field with somebody else. All it means is that I might have the insight to say, hey, here's something that I would like to pursue together with you. Not something that I want to point you in the direction of or say, come and meet me here and let me train you to be like me. No, it's journeying together. And I'll kind of finish with this before rounding up with the Lamentations piece of this. When you look at Christ interacting with his disciples, these are some of the most flawed people in the history of Scripture. We see that through the stories recorded in the Gospels. But this is while they're still walking with Jesus. Clearly, they had to learn more about Jesus at the same time that they had to learn more about themselves. The disciples messed up a lot while they were with Jesus, but because they were in relationship with him, there was opportunity to grow. A lot of the times that Jesus was telling parables to all of the people, the thousands of people who would come around to listen, the disciples were learning too. Even when Jesus sent the disciples out early on in their kind of apprenticeship or in their discipleship with Christ, half the time they didn't even know what they were doing. They went out and did amazing things and still came back not understanding what they were able to do. There was still a lot of learning that had to happen. It's definitely never a situation where because I'm following Jesus and because I'm in a relationship with him, that I'm above somebody else. The disciples struggled with that understanding too. I think Jeremiah struggles with it a little bit. I think David struggles with it. So when we look at things from that perspective, it should change the way, hopefully, change the way that I interact with everybody. Whether it's somebody who has some kind of spiritual knowledge in terms of my faith tradition or another faith tradition or none at all. We're all here. It's interesting. So much more to learn. With Lamentations as well. We're going to see a lot more of Jeremiah's struggle with his understanding of God and his own personal grief in dealing with what's happening right now. But we're going to see some other cool things too in another video. So for now, we out here and we out. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.